The girl's sobs tore through the silence like shards of glass, each cry more desperate than the last. Her tiny hands clenched into trembling fists, raw and bleeding from relentless scratching at the walls. "My hands hurt so much," she wailed, voice cracking under the weight of her pain and despair. Her tears streaked down her dirt-smudged face, pooling in the cracks of her cracked lips as she begged for relief she knew would never come. Her body shuddered with each ragged breath, her fragile frame trembling from hunger, fear, and exhaustion. She was alone in the darkness, abandoned by everyone who was supposed to care. The cold floor pressed against her knees as she curled into herself, clutching her aching hands like a lifeline. The shadows around her seemed to mock her suffering, twisting and writhing with sinister intent. Her stomach growled loudly, a cruel reminder of the days she had gone without food, her ribs protruding painfully under her trembling skin. The hunger gnawed at her insides, but it was nothing compared to the searing pain in her hands, now swollen and purple from crying and clawing at her own flesh in her desperation. She had been punished, beaten, starved, ignored by those who claimed to love her. Her tiny body bore the bruises of fists and belts, her innocence shattered beneath the weight of neglect. She had begged for mercy, for kindness, for someone to see her suffering, but only silence answered her cries. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and her voice grew hoarser as she cried out again, her voice cracking with anguish. "Please, anyone, please help me." Her tears blurred her vision as she looked around desperately, searching for a glimmer of hope amid the darkness. Her hands, now trembling uncontrollably, reached out in vain, clutching at the cold air, yearning for comfort that would never come. The pain in her palms was excruciating, burning, throbbing, sharp as knives, each movement sending a fresh wave of agony through her tiny body. She whimpered softly, the sound lost in the void, her spirit breaking under the weight of her suffering. Suddenly, a rush of movement shattered the oppressive silence. A figure burst into the room, a flash of radiant light amid the shadows. It was Jesus. His presence was overwhelming, filling the space with a divine force that seemed to pulsate with power and compassion. His eyes blazed with righteous fury and boundless love as he charged forward, voice booming and commanding as he shouted, "Enough!" The girl's sobs ceased abruptly, her mouth opening in a stunned gasp as she looked up at the figure towering before her. Her tear-streaked face was frozen in disbelief, caught between hope and fear. The air around Jesus shimmered with an unworldly glow, illuminating the darkness with a warmth that seemed to pierce straight into her broken heart. In that moment, everything changed. The shadows shrank back, retreating from the divine light. The pain in her hands, though still present, suddenly felt distant, less overwhelming, because she sensed something greater was about to unfold. Her trembling hands, still raw and swollen, seemed to find a strange comfort in Jesus's commanding presence. Her trembling lips quivered as she looked up at him, her tears giving way to a flicker of hope, a whisper of something she had never known before, hope that she was not forgotten, that her suffering would soon end. And as the divine figure loomed above her, his voice resonated with authority and mercy, hinting at a power that would shatter the chains of her pain, the darkness of her despair. The girl's trembling body relaxed just slightly, sensing that her cries had reached someone who cared, someone who could change everything. The room's shadows still lingered, but now they seemed to bow before the radiant figure, acknowledging that something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would bring light into the deepest darkness, healing what had been broken and restoring hope to the lost. The girl's journey to this moment had been long and heartbreaking, marked by neglect and betrayal that no child should ever endure. She was only 6, but her tiny hands bore the weight of a suffering far beyond her years. Her life had been a series of broken promises and cold indifference, starting from the day her parents abandoned her in the care of those who only saw her as a burden. Her mother had left her with a tear-streaked goodbye, promising she would come back soon, but she never did. Instead, She was handed over to her stepmother, an icy woman with no patience for children, only contempt. The woman's eyes were cold and calculating, her words sharp as knives when she scolded or punished the girl for the slightest mistake. The girl learned quickly that love was a lie and that her presence was unwelcome. Her stepfather was no better. He was a distant man, often absent, and when he was present, his anger was unpredictable. Sometimes he would shout at her, accusing her of being a nuisance. Other times he would ignore her altogether. Their home was a cold, unloving place, barely more than a shelter for their own comfort. Meals were scarce, often just stale bread or cold leftovers, and the girl learned to survive on scraps in silence. When she did ask for food, her voice was met with a sneer or a dismissive wave, as if her hunger was a crime. Her small hands, which once loved to draw and play, became rough and scarred from scrubbing floors, carrying heavy loads, and clawing at the walls. Anything to distract from the pain inside. But the worst part was the neglect, being left alone for hours on end, locked in dark rooms, with no one to comfort her or hear her cries. She was often punished for the smallest mistakes. Spilling milk, breaking a plate, or simply being too noisy. Her stepmother's punishments grew harsher over time, hitting her with belts or forcing her to stand in corners for hours. Her tiny body bore the bruises of her suffering, and her spirit was battered by constant rejection. Every night, she would curl up in her cold, lonely bed, clutching her hands that hurt more with each passing day. Hands that had been scoured raw from scrubbing floors, from clawing at the walls in despair, from trying to find some measure of comfort in her misery. Her tears had become a constant companion, flowing freely as she begged silently for a shred of kindness. "Please," she whispered to the empty room, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "My hands hurt so much." Her voice was barely audible over her sobs, each word a plea for relief from the pain. Physical, emotional, spiritual. She couldn't bear anymore. She was starving, exhausted, abandoned, forgotten by everyone who should have protected her. Her small face was streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes hollow and pleading. She had been pushed to the edge, her innocence shattered, her hope fading. In this darkness, she felt utterly alone, forsaken by the world. Her suffering was invisible to those who could help, buried beneath layers of indifference and cruelty. She had become a ghost in her own life, forgotten by her parents, ignored by her guardians. Her cries for help went unheard, her pain dismissed as childish fuss. She was a victim of injustice, a child cast aside and left to suffer in silence. Her young body, so fragile yet resilient, bore the scars of neglect, bruises from beatings, scratches from clawing at the walls, hunger gnawing at her insides. She was a victim of the cold cruelty that had seeped into her home, a victim of a society that often turned a blind eye to suffering children like her. And yet, despite all this darkness, something was about to change. A force greater than her pain was rushing toward her. Something divine and powerful that would shatter the chains of neglect and transform her world forever. Her trembling hands, her broken spirit. She didn't know it yet, but her story was about to take a turn toward hope. The girl's trembling hands clenched tightly as tears streamed down her dirt-streaked face. Her small body shuddered from the cold and the unbearable pain that had become her constant companion. She begged softly, her voice trembling. "My hands hurt so much." But no one heard her in that dark, silent house. Her suffering had become a relentless cycle, each day worse than the last. Each moment a new torment designed to break her spirit. It started with simple neglect, being ignored when she cried for food, her stomach growling fiercely in protest. Her tiny limbs, once full of curiosity and joy, had become weak from hunger and exhaustion. She had been denied even a crumb of bread so many times that her ribs pressed painfully against her skin. Her eyes, dull and hollow, searched desperately for a sign of kindness in the cold faces of those who were supposed to care. But they only saw a burden, a nuisance that must be silenced. One day, her stepmother, in a fit of rage, threw her out of the house. The girl had been pleading for warmth, for safety, clutching her aching hands and trembling in the icy wind. The stepmother's cruel words echoed in her ears. "You're useless. You're nothing," as she pushed her down the steps, sending her sprawling onto the muddy ground. Her clothes were soaked and torn, her hands scraped and bleeding from the rough stones. She curled up, shivering and crying, but her torment was far from over. Later that evening, they returned home, and her stepfather, drunk and angry, grabbed her by the arm. He dragged her inside, slamming her against the wall with a force that made her bones rattle. "Stupid girl," he spat, as he beat her with a belt, each lash leaving a fiery sting across her legs and back. Her face was streaked with tears, her voice muffled by her sobs. Her hands, already sore from scratching at the walls to find some comfort, now throbbed with fresh pain from the bruises and cuts. That night, she was denied even a sip of water and was forced to stand in the corner, trembling and trembling, her raw hands clenched into fists. When she tried to speak or ask for help, her stepmother insulted her, calling her a worthless burden, a cursed child. Her pleas for mercy went unheard, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Every insult, every slap, added to her pain, raising the weight of her suffering until she felt like she couldn't breathe. As days passed, her suffering only intensified. The cold was relentless, her small frame shivering under thin blankets, her hands aching from the constant scratching and clutching. They beat her again, this time for spilling a glass of water. Her stepmother's voice was venomous, laced with hatred. "You're pathetic, just like your mother." The girl's heart sank. This was worse than before, yet she could not escape. No matter how much she cried or begged, she was met with cruelty. Her world was a prison, and her pain was a chain she could not break. One afternoon, after another harsh punishment, her stepmother threw her out into the street once more. "Get out of my sight," she snapped, slamming the door behind her. The girl was left alone, trembling on the cold pavement, her hands raw and swollen, her body exhausted and broken. She curled into a tiny ball, tears flooding her face, desperately trying to hide her pain from the indifferent world. But the cruelty did not stop. The next day, her stepfather returned home, drunk and furious. He dragged her by the hair into the backyard, where he kicked her repeatedly, her small body flailing in the dirt. Her hands, already battered, scratched and scraped against the rough ground. She cried out in agony, begging for the pain to stop, but he only shouted, "You're useless. Why can't you be like other children?" Each new moment pushed her further into despair. More insults, more blows, more rejection. Her little hands, which once wanted to hold toys and draw happy pictures, now only knew the ache of suffering, the sting of neglect, and the heartbreak of abandonment. She was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from, with no hope of rescue, no one to hear her cries, no escape from this relentless cycle of pain. And just when it seemed her suffering could not possibly worsen, the darkness was broken by a sudden rush of divine power. Jesus burst into the scene, shouting with authority and compassion, a force so fierce it seemed to shake the very ground. His presence alone shattered the chains of cruelty and despair, promising that no child should ever endure such suffering alone. As he entered, the girl's trembling, torn hands clenched tighter, sensing that her pain was about to be confronted by something greater, something divine, something that would change everything. The girl's trembling body collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving ground of the alley. Her tiny hands, swollen and bleeding from hours of clawing at the rough walls and scratching her own skin in desperate pain, trembled uncontrollably. Her tears had long since run dry, replaced by a hollow, exhausted sob that escaped her cracked lips. Her voice was barely a whisper now, lost in the emptiness surrounding her. "My hands hurt so much," she repeated, her voice breaking apart as she curled into a fetal position, her small frame shivering violently from the cold and the shock of her suffering. The dirt and grime clung to her face, mixing with tears and sweat, giving her a ghostly appearance. Nothing left of the bright, curious girl she once was. Her body was weak, drained of strength from hunger that gnawed at her insides like a wild beast, leaving her trembling from head to toe. Her stomach growled fiercely, but no one was there to hear or care. The street was silent except for her ragged breathing and the faint, distant sounds of footsteps that never stopped. People passing by, indifferent, unseeing, unhearing. She looked up with blurred vision, her eyes glassy and vacant, searching for someone, anyone, to help her, but found only cold, empty streets. No warm hand reached out. No comforting voice called her name. Just silence, thick and suffocating. Her tiny fists clenched and unclenched as her body shook uncontrollably, her mind overwhelmed by the pain, hunger, and relentless neglect. Her head lolled back against the cold pavement, her cheeks streaked with tears and dirt. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her eyelids fluttered as if she might drift into unconsciousness. Her body desperately searching for relief, her soul screaming for salvation. Her hands, once so small and delicate, were now swollen, purple, and raw, cracked from clawing at the walls, scraped against the rough stones in her futile attempt to find comfort. Her clothes hung loosely on her frail frame, torn and stained, a testament to the harshness she endured. Every breath she took felt like her last. Her heart pounded painfully inside her chest, a pounding echo of her despair. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but her voice was lost in the void. Her trembling fingers reached out weakly, clutching at the empty air, as if she could grasp onto some hope, some salvation that was slipping further away. Her mind was clouded with despair. She felt abandoned by everyone, left to suffer alone in this dark, cruel world. The cold seeped into her bones, and her shivering intensified, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. She was so exhausted that her eyelids fluttered shut, her fragile body ready to give in. Could anyone see her? Could anyone hear her? Did anyone care that this tiny girl, broken and battered, was lying helpless in the street, begging silently for mercy? Just as her body was about to give out completely, and her spirit threatened to fade away, a sudden rush of divine energy shattered the air. The street seemed to tremble as Jesus burst onto the scene, shouting with authority, compassion, and fierce love. His voice cut through the silence like thunder, demanding attention, demanding justice. The girl's trembling stopped for just a moment, her eyes flickering open, filled with a mixture of fear and awe. She looked up, barely able to recognize the radiant figure that now towered before her, so full of power and mercy. Her trembling hands clenched tighter as her breath caught in her throat. In that moment, everything felt suspended. The pain, the hunger, the loneliness. Everything was about to change. But until then, she lay there, helpless, vulnerable, and forgotten, in the shadow of a cruel world that seemed to turn away just when she needed help most. The girl's trembling body lay motionless on the cold, unforgiving ground. Her tiny fists curled into trembling balls, blood and dirt smudged across her fragile skin. Her face was streaked with tears, silent, unceasing tears that fell without a sound, slipping down her cheeks to mingle with the dirt and grime. Her breath was shallow, each inhale trembling as if her lungs struggled to keep her alive. Her eyes stared blankly upward, fixed on the dark, cloudy sky above, searching for something she couldn't name. Perhaps a sign, perhaps a hope, perhaps simply the sky's vastness to drown out her pain. She was exhausted beyond words, worn down by the relentless suffering that had consumed her for so long. Her hands, swollen and raw, clutched her chest in silent protest, trembling from hunger, cold, and the overwhelming weight of despair. She had no strength left to cry out. Her voice had been stolen by exhaustion, her cries swallowed by the silence of a world that had abandoned her. Her trembling lips parted slightly, and with a voice so faint it was barely more than a whisper, she murmured a prayer, soft and trembling, yet filled with all the hope she could summon. "Please, help me," she whispered into the emptiness, her voice trembling as it escaped her throat. It was a plea that went unheard, lost in the vast silence surrounding her. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment, and in that fleeting instant, she surrendered. Her small body relaxed into the cold pavement, her spirit weary and almost broken. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped her, as if her very soul was giving up, surrendering to the darkness that threatened to consume her entirely. Her silent tears continued to fall, a river of grief that reflected the storm raging inside her fragile heart. The world around her seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen, for some miracle to break through the despair. The sky above was heavy with dark clouds, casting shadows that danced across her trembling form. Everything was suspended in a tense, breathless pause, as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting for a sign that change was coming. The girl's eyes stared upward, lost in a sea of gray, her mind adrift in thoughts of hopelessness and longing for salvation. Her trembling hands pressed against her chest, clutching at the last remnants of hope, though she knew deep down that her suffering might never end. Her body was cold, her cheeks streaked with tears, her tiny frame so fragile that it felt like it could shatter at any moment. Her whispered prayer faded into the silence, a fragile echo of her desperate plea. Just as her heart felt ready to break, just as she was about to succumb to the darkness that threatened to swallow her whole, a sudden stillness fell over everything. The air seemed to tighten, thick with anticipation. The clouds above remained heavy, but a flicker of something unseen stirred in the silence. An expectant pause that stretched on, as if the universe itself was waiting for a sign that hope was about to arrive. Everything seemed to hold its breath. The girl's eyes remained fixed on the sky, her face a mask of surrender and hope intertwined. A silent prayer to a distant, perhaps unseen, force. Her small, trembling hands remained pressed against her chest, clutching at the last shreds of hope as the world waited in suspended anticipation. The moment stretched into eternity, a fragile, breathless silence before the divine, the miraculous, the unexpected, something that would change everything, was about to unfold. The girl's silent tears continued to fall, her trembling hands clutching her chest as if holding herself together by a fragile thread. Her small body shivered from the cold and the pain that seemed to pierce her very soul. She had begged, whispered desperately into the darkness. "My hands hurt so much," her voice barely audible, yet filled with a raw, aching need for relief. Her eyes, pools of sorrow and despair, stared upward at the gray, clouded sky, searching for something, anything, that could bring her comfort, a sign that she was not alone in her suffering. Her whispered prayer was a fragile plea for help, a desperate call into an empty universe that seemed to have turned its back on her. She was exhausted beyond measure, her body drained and her spirit nearly broken. The silence around her was oppressive, heavy with grief and despair, suspended in a moment that felt like eternity. As she lay there, vulnerable and pleading, the darkness around her seemed to deepen. The clouds above churned with a restless fury, casting shifting shadows over her fragile figure. Everything was still, silent, waiting for what no one could say. And then, in that suspended moment, everything changed. A sudden, powerful presence erupted into the scene. Unexpected, unanticipated, and utterly divine. The air grew thick with a strange, luminous energy. It was as if the heavens had opened just for her, and a radiant light pierced through the heavy clouds, illuminating the darkness with overwhelming brilliance. The light was warm, gentle, yet undeniable in its authority. It was the presence of Jesus. He arrived at the exact moment when no one expected, when hope seemed lost, when despair had taken its final hold. His entrance was like a burst of dawn after the longest night, sudden, overwhelming, and profound. His eyes, filled with compassion and mercy, immediately sought out the girl's trembling form. His presence was a balm, a reassurance that all suffering, no matter how deep or dark, was not forgotten. In a voice that resonated with authority and love, Jesus shouted, "Peace, be still." His words cut through the heavy silence like a clear, divine command. Instantly, the oppressive clouds above began to part, as if obeying his voice. The darkness lifted, replaced by a gentle glow that bathed everything in a soothing light. The girl's trembling hands, which had clutched her chest so desperately, felt a warm surge of comfort. Like a gentle touch, a promise that her pain was seen and understood. His arrival was the turning point, the moment when hope was reborn in the midst of despair. The relief that washed over the girl was almost palpable. It was as if the weight of the world was lifted from her tiny shoulders. Her eyes widened, no longer filled with terror, but with a flicker of hope, a fragile seed of trust that someone had finally come to her aid. She looked at Jesus, her gaze filled with awe and gratitude. Her silent tears now mingled with a quiet, trembling smile. Jesus approached her with gentle steps, his presence radiating peace and comfort. He knelt beside her, his voice soft but firm, speaking words of reassurance and love. "My child," he said, "I am here. Your pain is not forgotten. You are seen, and you are loved beyond measure." His words, simple yet profound, carried the power to heal not only her body but her wounded spirit. His touch was tender, a divine caress that sent a wave of relief through her tiny, aching hands. In that moment, everything seemed to pause. Time, pain, despair, all giving way to a divine promise of hope and restoration. The audience watching this scene could feel their hearts swell with relief and deep emotion. The darkness that once seemed insurmountable was pierced by the light of Jesus' presence. The girl, once so fragile and broken, now looked up with eyes shining with newfound hope. Tears of joy replaced the tears of pain, and a profound sense of peace settled over her. It was as if a miracle had already begun, a new chapter of healing, love, and redemption. In that divine moment, everything changed. The suffering was not the end but a beginning, the beginning of hope, of comfort, of restoration. Jesus had arrived, not just as a figure in a story, but as the answer to her suffering, the embodiment of divine compassion. His presence was the turning point, the moment that made all the difference. And in the quiet aftermath, as the light continued to shine, the girl knew she was no longer alone. She had found her hope, her peace, her salvation, and that hope would carry her forward, forever illuminated by the divine love that had come at just the right moment. In that moment, when the divine presence of Jesus burst into the darkness, everything changed. The air itself seemed to shimmer with a new energy, a calm, powerful force that washed over the girl and those around her. Her trembling body, which had been broken and trembling with pain, suddenly felt a surge of strength, an awakening deep within her, as if a gentle but unstoppable wave of hope had risen from the depths of her soul. Her eyes, once filled with despair and silent tears, now reflected a flicker of light. It was as if the unseen chains of suffering and fear had begun to loosen, replaced by a quiet but undeniable sense of safety and divine protection. She looked up at Jesus, her small, trembling frame now somehow steadier, her breathing less ragged. Though her hands still throbbed, a new resilience blossomed within her, an unspoken promise that she was no longer alone in her suffering. Her whispered prayer had been heard. Her plea for help had been answered. The moment of divine intervention had made all the difference. As Jesus approached her, the cruel adults who had inflicted pain and neglect on her stood frozen in stunned silence. Their eyes widened in shock, some with guilt, others with disbelief. Their faces, once filled with harshness and indifference, now flushed with shame. They had expected her to remain broken, to surrender to her pain, to be silenced forever. But the arrival of Jesus had shattered their illusion. Their jaws tightened, and some took a step back, as if the very presence of divine authority was exposing their cruelty for what it truly was. The shame was visible in their eyes, an undeniable acknowledgement that their acts of abuse and neglect were now laid bare before the divine light. In the face of Jesus' arrival, their arrogance and cruelty crumbled. They were silenced, unable to speak or justify their actions under his gaze. The girl, meanwhile, found her voice, not in words, but in a quiet, trembling breath of relief. She felt the weight of her suffering lift, replaced by a powerful sense of protection that seemed to surround her like an invisible shield. Jesus' presence was a divine barrier that pushed away the darkness of cruelty, a promise that she was safe now, no longer vulnerable to the harm of those who had previously hurt her. This moment proved that her suffering was not in vain. It was a testimony to divine justice and mercy, a powerful reminder that even in the deepest darkness, hope could ignite unexpectedly. The pain she had endured, the tears she had shed in silence, were not meaningless. They were the very foundation upon which divine love could act, transforming despair into renewal. Jesus' intervention illuminated the truth. Suffering, when met with divine compassion, could be a catalyst for change, for healing, for redemption. The girl's face, once marked by fear and pain, now bore a gentle glow, an expression of quiet strength and newfound courage. Her eyes, still moist with tears, now sparkled with a profound trust. She sensed that her suffering had touched something greater, a divine purpose that was unfolding right before her eyes. Her small body, which had once cowered in helplessness, now stood a little taller, emboldened by the knowledge that she was protected by divine love. The darkness had not won. It had been broken by the arrival of Jesus, who had come to bring justice, mercy, and hope. In the background, those cruel adults, shocked, ashamed, and silenced, began to realize the gravity of what had happened. Their arrogance had been challenged by a divine presence that demanded justice and compassion. Their faces flickered with remorse, and some looked away, ashamed of their actions. They had underestimated the power of divine love to confront evil and to restore what had been broken. The scene was a testament to the truth that suffering, met with faith and divine intervention, could be transformed into a testimony of hope and redemption. This was a turning point, a moment that proved suffering was not meaningless, and that divine love could change even the darkest circumstances. The girl, now protected and comforted, understood that her pain had become part of a greater story, one of hope, healing, and divine justice. She was no longer alone in her suffering. She had found strength in divine presence. Her tears of pain were now mixed with tears of relief and gratitude. In that sacred encounter, hope had been reborn, and everything had truly changed. In the gentle aftermath of Jesus' powerful arrival, the girl's trembling form slowly began to settle. The once silent tears now shimmered with a quiet, renewed strength, as if a new light had filled her small body. Her eyes, which had been clouded with pain and despair, now glowed with a soft, peaceful hope. Her hands, though still tender and aching, no longer felt like instruments of suffering, but became symbols of resilience, reminders that even in the deepest darkness, healing is possible. Her breathing grew steadier, calmer, as if the divine presence had woven a calmness into her very soul. She sat upright, cradling her hands gently, feeling a warmth that was not just physical but spiritual, a reassurance that she was seen, loved, and protected. In that sacred moment, she was no longer a victim of cruelty, but a child of divine love, restored and renewed by the mercy of Jesus. Jesus' departure was as gentle as his arrival was powerful. His radiant light lingered for a moment longer, a silent promise of ongoing love and hope. Then, with a gentle smile, he looked at her and softly spoke words that resonated deep within her heart. "My child," he said, "you are precious in my sight. No pain can diminish your worth, and no darkness can extinguish your light. Remember, I am always near, even when you cannot see me. When your hands hurt or your heart feels heavy, know that my love is with you, a comfort that never fades. Keep faith, for hope is never lost, and love will always find a way to shine through the darkest night. His words, full of gentle power, were a divine embrace, an assurance that no matter what hardships may come, she is never alone. His message echoed in her heart like a song of hope, reminding her of her inherent worth and the unbreakable bond of divine love that surrounds her. As Jesus' radiant figure began to fade into the soft glow of light, the scene carried a quiet, reflective stillness. The girl looked up, her face now calm and filled with a peaceful confidence. Her eyes, once trembling with fear, now shone with a quiet strength, a testament to the transformative power of divine love. She felt a deep sense of safety, as if an invisible shield had wrapped her in comfort and hope. Her heart, once heavy with pain, now carried a gentle warmth, a light that would guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The audience watching this scene is invited to reflect on this incredible moment of divine intervention. It's a reminder that even in the moments when we feel most broken, most alone, or overwhelmed by pain, divine love and hope are never far away. Jesus' presence in the girl's life was not just an act of compassion, but a declaration that suffering is not the end of the story. It's an invitation for each of us to consider, where in your life do you need to recognize the presence of Jesus? Do you see his love shining through your darkest moments? Are you open to trusting that even when circumstances seem hopeless, divine mercy is quietly working behind the scenes to bring restoration and peace? Take a moment now to ask yourself, have I truly acknowledged Jesus' presence in my own struggles? Do I allow his love to comfort me when I feel overwhelmed? Am I willing to believe that no pain is too great for divine healing? This story invites us to open our eyes and hearts, to seek Jesus in our darkest nights, and to trust in his message of love and hope. Because just as the girl found safety and peace in his presence, so can we, if we choose to recognize and accept his divine care in our own lives. Remember, the journey of faith is not only about seeking Jesus when we are in trouble, but about trusting that his love is always near, ready to restore, comfort, and renew us. When we face our own moments of pain and despair, may we remember her story and ask ourselves, am I open to seeing Jesus' love in my life today? Am I willing to accept his message of hope and let it transform my suffering into a story of healing? Because in recognizing his presence, we find the strength to carry on, knowing that we are forever loved and never truly alone.